You see these posts online all the time, hyping up India's incredible growth story. And honestly, it sounds amazing, like we're watching an economic powerhouse being born. But is the hype actually matching the reality on the ground? All right, let's dive in and see what the data really has to say about it.
So the narrative you usually hear is built on three really big selling points. First, that India is pulling in record-breaking amounts of foreign investment. Second, that it's a consumer-led economy, just like the US or Europe. And third, it's got this perfect track record of never, ever defaulting on its debt. I mean, on the surface, that all sounds fantastic, right? So let's take a closer look at each one.
Okay, first up, foreign direct investment, or FDI. This is usually the headline act, the big proof that global money is betting big on India's future. So what's the real story here? Let's unpack that claim.
And hey, to be fair, if you just look at the raw number, the absolute dollar amount, the claim is technically true. More cash is flowing in than ever before. But as you know with economics, the headline number rarely, if ever, tells the whole story. This is the really crucial question we have to ask. How big is that investment when you compare it to the size of the entire economic pie? Is it a genuine game changer, or is it kind of just a drop in the bucket?
And this is where the story completely flips. The moment you scale that investment as a percentage of the total economy, the GDP, the picture changes dramatically. Instead of a boom, we're actually looking at inflows that are scraping multi-decade lows. Just look at this comparison for a second. Today, FDI is just barely 0.7% of GDP. But if you go back to 2008, it was more than 3 times that, clocking in above 2.1%. So what this is really telling us is that when you adjust for how big the economy has gotten, global investors aren't exactly piling in. In fact, in relative terms, they're kind of holding back. All right, so let's move on to that second big claim, which is definitely connected to the first point, and that's this idea that India is a powerful consumer-led economy. Now, the number that gets thrown around a lot is that consumption makes up about 60% of India's GDP. And that's a big deal because it's a very similar number to what you'd see in developed nations like the United States. And that's exactly why people make that comparison so often. But, and this is so important, context is everything here. In a rich, high-income country, having high consumption is a sign of economic strength. But in a low-income country, where the average income is only around $2,000 per person, that same high consumption, well, it's actually a liability. So why is it a liability? Well, think about it. If a low-income country is leaning so heavily on consumption, it means there's less money left over for the two things that actually drive long-term income growth: investment and exports. And you can see the effect right here in the chart. Investment as a share of the economy has really struggled to get back to where it used to be. And that brings us to the third and final selling point in this whole growth narrative: India's supposedly perfect track record when it comes to its debt. The line you always hear, and it's said almost like a badge of honor, is that India has never defaulted. It's held up as this ultimate sign of fiscal responsibility, like it's a guarantee of stability for the future. But here's the thing you have to understand about financial markets. They care about the future, not the past. There's a great line that sums it up perfectly. Bond markets don't hand out brownie points for perfect attendance.
So why is it irrelevant today? Well, for starters, markets price risk based on today's income and debt levels, not ancient history. A perfect past record doesn't magically make your borrowing costs cheaper now if your current books look risky. I mean, think about it. Italy hasn't defaulted in modern times either, but you don't hear anyone bragging about it because it doesn't change their current economic challenges.
So when we put all three of these points together and step back, what conclusion do we come to? Are we looking at a genuine growth story, or is it something else entirely?
Let's just recap really quickly. The claim of a record FDI turns out to be pretty tiny when you actually measure it against the size of the economy. The supposed consumer boom looks a lot more like a premature liability for a low-income country, and that perfect debt record, well, it's just not relevant to what it costs to borrow money in the here and now.
So when you look at it that way, the conclusion is pretty stark. If these three arguments, FDI that's actually tiny, a consumer boom that's too early, and a debt record that's irrelevant, if that's the best case you can make for the economy, well then you're not really building a growth story, you're building spin.
And that kind of leaves us with the final thought. What we might be looking at here isn't some guaranteed destiny of economic greatness, but maybe, just maybe, a narrative that's standing on some pretty thin ice.